and welcome to my next full course on Gimp. This one's about selection and selection only. So we can select objects in Gimp using different tools: rectangle select, ellipse select, which are the marquee tools, free select, scissor select, foreground. There's a fuzzy select, select by color, and we can even use the paths tool. So lots of options, and there's also a select in the top menu. And I want to go over all of this in detail. If you're a beginner when it comes to Gimp, I wouldn't advise you to watch this one first. Instead, watch my beginner tutorial. You can find that on my channel homepage. So if you're totally new and you've never used Gimp before and you want to have kind of like a comprehensive intro, check out my channel. Scroll down to my Gimp playlist right here in the photography, view the playlist. And there is my full Gimp beginner course, close to 4 hours long. Work through that, and once you've done that, come back for this selection course. But if you already know beginner stuff in Gimp, or you've watched my full beginner course, then this selection course might be for you. I've excluded this from my beginner course because selecting can be a little bit frustrating in Gimp, and I didn't want to frustrate a beginner because that would turn you off from using Gimp. And even though Gimp can be frustrating, it's a good tool, it's a good software, especially if you factor in that it's free. For us to start with the selections, simply make sure that under Edit and Preferences, you use the same window as me. Obviously, as you can see, I'm using the English language version, but the layout, you want to set that to default. And you can do that here under Interface, open the drop down, and then Window Management. Here it says Reset Saved Window Position to Default Values. And this is what you want to click on, confirm we are OK, and then restart Gimp. And when you've restarted it, it should look exactly like my layout here, as I'm using the default layout. And just for your information, under Help and About, you can see the version that I'm using. Sometimes they change things in Gimp, but if it's a serious change in layout, I will create a new video. For the most part, they don't do that. So even if it's now Gimp version 3 for you, or 2.11, whatever, it should still look like my version here. Once you've checked all of that, so your layout and your version, we can dive right in. As I've already shown you, there are lots of options to select stuff in Gimp. But one thing to fundamentally understand is the layers menu. So when things are on different layers, you have to select them via the layers menu. Let me, for example, create a new layer by clicking on this plus icon. I make it transparent and I call it rect for rectangle. So I open this drop down, fill with, use transparency, confirm we are OK. And now I not only have the black background, but also an empty rect layer. If I now use, for example, the rectangle select, rectangle marquee tool, left click drag, and then I use a white color and the bucket fill tool, I left click on the selection, and then I go to select none. I have a white rectangle. It's on top of the background, but it's important to understand that it's not placed or painted where the black areas were. Instead, it's stacked on top of it because it's on a different layer. And when we now use this move tool here, I can select the layers and then move both of these elements individually, and the other one is not affected. So this is one important thing to understand, the layers menu. Let me create another one, this time for an inverted rectangle, and I make it transparent again. Yet again, rectangle marquee tool, left click drag. And here's another principle that's important to understand. I'll make this a red foreground color. This area is still selected, but if I now go to select and invert, I have everything selected but this area. And this is what the select inversion does. And if I now left click on the selection area, you can see that everything is red except for the part that we've selected prior with the rectangle select tool, the marquee tool. So we've basically created a cutout. Let me go to select none yet again. The white one isn't visible anymore, and it's not because we've painted over it, but it's the layer below, the red invert rect. Therefore, if we bring this white rect layer on top by using these arrow icons below, we can see the white again. And once more, I use the move tool, and I can drag these three elements now around. This is white, here's the red one, And if I drag the background, the black one, you can see that our red, the invert rect layer has a cutout. This is always indicated by this checkerboard design. So whenever we talk about selection, we also have to factor in the layers menu. And that's just a part to remember whenever you work in Gimp or even in Photoshop. These are all layered based programs, so where you stack stuff on top of one another. We're going to go over the details of the rectangle marquee tool as well, so don't worry too much if that was too quick. Important is to understand the layer structure. One more thing to add is we can also merge layers. In our case, the white one, the rect, and the red one, the invert rect. Let us merge this by using the icon down below right here. For it to work, we'll have to be on the top layer, in our case the white rect layer, because it always merges down. I left click, and now if I make this invisible, you can see we only have the black background and our combined rect layer. And if I use the move tool on it, we will now move white and red at the same time. So if we wanted to move now the white one without the red one, it wouldn't work anymore because it's on the same layer. We will encounter this problem a couple of times, or we will encounter this behavior of Gimp a couple of times in the future chapters of this course. So if you stick with me, this is going to become second nature. I want you in every chapter to practice, so not just watch my video, but actually do something, because this is the way you learn how to use a program like Gimp, by doing. So let us go over this step by step again, and I want you to recreate it as we go. What I do is I delete this layer by clicking on the X down here. We only have a black background, and if yours isn't black, don't worry. If you have a background that's white, whatever, just use that. We will create a new layer on top. Let me call that 1. I'll make that transparent. Then I click on the rectangle select tool, left click drag, and now I click on these little icons right here. These are always black and white, and this turns my swatches black and white. And then you can click on the double arrow to flip them. In my case, I use a white foreground color on a black background. If you have a white background, just use a black foreground color. I use this bucket fill tool, left click on the selection, and now I have a white rectangle. In this layer menu, I can double click on the names, in my case the 1, and rename that to white. Just confirm via enter, then select none. We'll create a second rectangle. Let me directly call that red. Transparency, once again, is selected. Confirm via OK. Click on your color swatch in the foreground, in my case the white one, make it red. Confirm via OK. Select an area yet again. Bucket fill tool, left click, select none. You should have 3 different colors now, 2 rectangles and a background. And now use the move tool right here, and then move each around. And if that works individually for you, you've done it the right way. Always make sure to actually do these projects, these little tasks, before you move on to the next chapter. Let us start into our first real chapter. Here I've got 2 photos, 2 images. I found them on Unsplash, and you can use them here for free if you want to use the same or use similar ones. It's a good website, and as I've said, it's free. It can even be used commercially. So check it out. I'm going to link to it in the video description. Let's go back to Gimp, and here the image of a car. We might want to somehow make this license plate invisible or unreadable. One way to do that is to select it using the rectangle select tool. And when you activate it, you see these tool options. Almost every tool in Gimp has tool options. Some are more complex, some aren't. You should see them by default. But if you can't, just go to Windows, use dockable dialogs, and there are all tools listed, and tool options can be found at the very top. That's the first option in the default layout. Left click on it, and then it should pop up. In my case, it already is, so it's just getting highlighted. But whenever you get lost somehow in Gimp and you can't find something, just go to Windows, dockable dialogs, and there you should find it. Don't get confused by all the options. We will talk about the modes in this chapter first. And there are 4 for the rectangle and the ellipse tool. First one replaces selections. So I make a selection, then I drag a second one, and the first one disappears. When I have the second mode active, left click on it, I can add parts to the selection. There's also an option for subtract. So if I now drag over this, I can get rid of parts of my current selection and even split selections into two. The final one is for intersections. So intersections are basically the overlaps between an existing selection and the one that you're dragging. Let me make a big one, and now I use the intersection. And this will now only be this top part, and it gets smaller and smaller with each intersection. What you need for the most part are the first two, so dragging a new one which replaces the old one and adding parts to a selection. We will start fresh, so we'll go to select none. Short key for that is Shift-Ctrl-A. It's a good idea to memorize that, because you're going to need this short key a lot. And now we'll drag this rectangle selection over the license plate. And by the way, I hold Ctrl and use the mouse wheel for zooming. In this case, it doesn't really matter if I have the first or the second mode active. I like to work on copies and on new layers to not mess with the original. So I create a new layer for our plate and I make it transparent. The selection is still active, and now I can use the bucket fill tool right here. Use black as a foreground color and left click on the selection to color it black. Shift-Ctrl-A to deselect, and we can't see the license plate anymore. Let us check our second example. Just a crowd of people. And let's just say we want to make these faces blurry, at least the three ones that are somewhat in focus. And we can use the ellipse tool for that, but we need the second mode to add parts to our selection. When we have the first mode active, it would replace the old one. So I'll activate the second mode, left click drag. You can see the other modes, they still work. And whenever you get lost, Shift-Ctrl-A to deselect it all and then start fresh. We want to do that right here. So these three faces I want to cover. Therefore I need the second mode. Left click drag. And you may have noticed there is this bounding box and there is a rectangle in every corner. And that can be used to adjust the selection. But keep in mind it only works for the last selected. So if I try to left click on the first one, it's going to give me a new selection. So we don't want that. Shift-Ctrl-A again. We'll start with the first one, resize it via these rectangles. We're good here, so I'll move on to the second one, and then the third. And now we want to make that blurry. To do that, we don't create a new layer, instead we copy this image. So it is called 2, therefore we'll get image 2 copy. Then we'll go to filters, blur, and use a Gaussian blur. And I'll just make this 50 and confirm. Shift-Ctrl-A to deselect, and we've got our faces blurred. It looks very unnatural, and this is because there are very hard edges. And this is where the second part of this chapter comes into play, the feather. Let us create our face selection yet again on the original. And you can see I've made the copy invisible, the 2 copy layer, by clicking on this eye icon. I'll copy the original yet again, and now go to select, and there's a feather option. Left click on it and this menu should pop up. Here you can set a value. By default it's pixels and it depends on the size of the image that you use. Let me try 10. Maybe that's a little bit too small, but we'll go to filter. We can repeat the Gaussian blur or just use the menu once again. I'll confirm, Shift-Ctrl-A, and now the edges aren't as harsh, but let me go back using Ctrl-Z, so you can undo the last steps using Ctrl-Z. And I'm going to apply a new feather, and this time I'll make that 50 pixels. Yet again, filters, blur, Gaussian blur, or reshow, Gaussian blur, and I applied Shift-Ctrl-A, and now the faces are blurred, but it looks much more natural thanks to these feathered edges. This comes in handy in many ways, but it becomes most obvious if I just create a white background. So let me do that by creating a new layer. I call that BG for background. Put it to the top. Black is my foreground color. I use the ellipse select, create a new layer, black without feather, and I make it transparent. Bucket fill tool and left click on the selection. I'll create a new layer, this time black with feather. Yet again, it's transparent. I make the one without the feather invisible. And then I go to select feather and I make that 100. Confirm we are okay. And I use the bucket fill tool. Still black is my foreground color. Left click on the selection. Shift-Ctrl-A to deselect. And you can see the difference between a hard edge and a feathered edge. So the edge gets blurred out with a feather, you could say. And if there's none, this is not happening. And that's what creates the difference when it comes to blurred faces here. This one was with the feather, much more natural. And the one above, it was without a feather, much harsher edges, as it doesn't blur out. Sorry for the typos here. But now we're good. So keep these two principles in mind. You should understand the modes of the tools and the feather. And for you to practice, if you've understood it, I want you to redo these last two steps. So the first one was the license plate on a car. What we've done here was using the rectangle tool, first or second mode. We've created a new layer. We have black as foreground color and use the bucket fill tool on it. Then left click on the selection and your plate isn't visible anymore. Shift-Ctrl-A to deselect. And the second thing that we've did was the blurring of the faces. So once more, ellipse tool, second mode is active for adding parts to selection. Blurred the three faces right here. I've copied the original, then I've used filters, blur, Gaussian blur, around 40 to 50. This was without the feather, and I've done the same yet again with a feather. So I've selected the three faces, second mode is active, then select feather. I use 50, confirm we are okay. Copy the image, and then yet again filters, blur, Gaussian blur. Once more deselect by using Shift-Ctrl-A. Make sure that you do that yourself. You can go to Unsplash and search for, was it people? No, I believe it was crowd. So when you type in crowd, you should find. Here it is, there's the image. So type in crowd, and for the second one, just type in car. And you should get a car with a license plate to blur or to paint black. Let us talk about two more things using the tools that I've already shown you in the last chapter. Number one is we can combine these two. So we'll start with the rectangle. Got the first mode active for replacing the selection. And now I activate the ellipse select. I use the second mode for adding parts to selection. And I can left click drag over the first one. And if I activate the move tool, you can see this is now a combined selection. And this is usually what you need for many projects in GIMP. You have to combine a couple of selection tools to create a combined selection. In many cases, it's surely more complex than this one. Well, let me try to create like a keyhole or something. So here I've replaced it. I press Ctrl Z to get back to what we've had. And now I use the third mode for subtracting. I have the rectangle select active. And now I've created this cutout. Now I use the ellipse select. In this case, I don't want to add parts to the selection because I want to add something to the cutout. And therefore I need the third mode and not the second mode, as you can see here. So adding parts would actually subtract from the subtraction. Therefore I need to subtract. I'm going to make that a bit bigger up here. You get the idea. It's a very bad keyhole. I did it by hand, sorry about that. But I think you can see what it should have been. So if I create a new layer now, and I use the paint bucket tool, left click on it, Shift Ctrl A to deselect or go to select none. And this would be one way to create icons and these simple shapes in GIMP. When we later on select something more complex, you're going to understand how combining these various tools is important. For you to practice this, let's recreate the keyhole and I try to make it a bit better. We'll start with the rectangle tool. We need the first mode or the second mode. Left click drag. Activate the ellipse tool. We need the second mode for adding parts to selection. We select the rectangle select tool. And this time we need to subtract, which is the third mode. And now, yet again, ellipse select, third mode for subtracting. And I believe it should have been at the top and not at the bottom. So now it's an inverted keyhole. To be technically correct here, we'll create a new layer. Bucket fill tool, make this blue, left click on it, Shift Ctrl A to deselect. So try to create something like this just to practice combining these tools. And once you've done that, let us talk about the other options of these two tools. Because for now I've only talked about the modes, but there's way more right here under tool options. Yet again, if you can't see that, go to Windows, Dockable Dialogs and use it. It should be the first option, tool options, left click on it, and then you should see it. Let us create a selection. And now we'll go to the numbers first position. When we adjust that numerically, you can see how the selection moves in the X and the Y axis. Same principle applies for size, but in this case, obviously, we'll adjust the size and not the position. We can also use a fixed aspect ratio right here. You can set it to width, height, or use the aspect ratio. When you check the box, it's going to use the current one. So what I've created earlier, what was it like? Almost 1 to 1.2, 1.25. And here under current you can reset that. Then we have guides. These are just helping guidelines. As long as a selection is active, you can apply them. So if you want to use the rule of thirds to position it correctly, try the guides. Box above for highlighting, it just makes it a little bit easier to see it, and shrink merged. Keep that unchecked. As much as the highlights, you don't really need that. It's just something to play with. Expand from center makes a difference. By default, it starts at a corner. So depending on where you click and then drag and move your mouse, it's going to expand from that point on. But when you have expand from center active, you're going to click and then this box will expand from the center. So not from a corner of the rectangle, instead from the center. We can round the corners and then you get a slider. If you crank it up fully, you've got a circle. And here above it is the feather option. We've already used that under select and feather, so it's basically the same here. Anti-aliasing is for smoothing the corners. Keep that active. In 99% of the case you want smoother edges, smoother corners. The ellipse tool has the same options except for one. Obviously the rounded corners is missing as it is in ellipse, and ellipses don't have corners, but everything else is the same. So feathering, expanding from center, fixed ratio, position, size, the guides. To get a feel for it, we need something to practice. So let me give you an inverted and badly drawn keyhole. In this case, we'll just create a couple of rectangles. We'll start with the first mode. Create a new layer. I'll call it shapes and it's transparent. I confirm via enter. I use the paint bucket tool, make it black, shift Ctrl A. I'll create another one, but this time feather edges is active and I make that around 25. Again, use a black color. Shift Ctrl A. Yet another one. This time we want to round the corners and I uncheck feather edges. Something like this. Oh, and here we can see a little bit of a glitch. Sometimes that happens in Gimp. Let me create a new selection. I keep the rounded corners. Yet again, paint bucket tool. And you can see it works on all edges. It should at least. Sometimes it doesn't due to some glitches. Gimp isn't perfect. But let me go back when that happens. I press Ctrl Z to this selection. And now I add yet again the black color. And if that happens, simply go to the area that isn't colored and left click again. And you can see this has covered the glitch, or we've gotten around that glitch and we have the result that we wanted. Let me also show you an example for a fixed aspect ratio, and we'll adjust the aspect ratio here. So current, I'll make that 16 by 9, but if I check it now and I drag it, you can see it's 1 by 1, because this is basically the default and it has now changed the size numerical values to 387 to 387, which is 1 by 1. So if you want to actually change that to a different aspect ratio, go to current right here, left click, and then type it in, for example, 9 by 16. And now if I drag it, you can see it's the TikTok format, 16 by 9. This would be a YouTube video format. I press enter and it's adjusted. So create a 16 by 9. And here we have another glitch, but we'll fix that by clicking on the empty spot here. Shift Ctrl A to deselect it again. Finally, ellipse, and we'll directly add a feather of around 10, and this time make it red. Once more, Shift Ctrl A. So make sure to recreate these shapes, to play around with these options of the select tools, and once you've done that, you're ready for the next chapter. Let us forget about the select and the ellipse tool for a moment, because we want to select something that has a more complex shape, like this flower. You can try to use the rectangle tool, use the second mode for adding parts to selections, but you're not going to get there. And if you do, it's going to take you a long time. It's way better to use a different tool for this. And one that we could use is the paths tool. It's an intimidating tool, but it's actually fairly easy to understand. It only has 3 modes, and then you can perform actions with the result. For example, create a selection from that path that you create, which is what we're going to do. 3 modes are easy to understand, I think. The first one, the design mode, is the free mode. So you left click and you create these nodes, these corners of your path. And then when you want to close it, you go to edit and then you click on the first one and you've got a closed path. You can now click on each of them and this gives you handles. You can drag them like this to create curves. When you go back to design, you can readjust the positions of these corners, these nodes, and the move is for the entire path, so you can move that thing entirely around. And once you've got your path, click on, for example, selection from path, and here we have our selection created. And that's an easier way to create more complex selections than using these rectangle and ellipse tools. Let us select the flower. I've mentioned it before, I like to work on copies and new layers, so I copy this original. And now we'll use the path tool and we'll go over the edges. Don't worry too much about curves for now. We'll just go over the edge roughly. All that we do is left click and follow the outline. I press the spacebar to move around in the image, and for zooming I hold Control and then I use the mouse wheel. Once I've arrived at the start point, I switch from design to edit mode. I can simply hold Control for that, which is indicated here in the two options of this path tool. And then I hover over the start point and I left click and we've got a closed path. Second step is to create the curves. And to do that, we need to be in design mode, and then you can hover over these lines and left click drag. This gives you the handles. Once you misclick, like I did here, just press Ctrl Z and then left click drag on the handles to adjust the curvature. When it comes to these projects, it's all about how much time do you invest. So you can make these results very, very detailed. As this is just a tutorial project, I don't want to waste too much time, so I go over this once again a little bit roughly. If you want to readjust these nodes, again design mode, left click on them and drag them. Here is a good position where I could add an additional node, so I kind of forgot this water drop. To do that, we'll hover over this line and then double click, but we need to have the edit mode active. So you can hold Control and then double click on this line and then you have a new node. I'll continue with the outline. But that looks fine. And now we want to create a selection from path. We can do that here with the button under select from path. We can also right click and there is a select option yet again, where we can use from path. So there are always many different options to do the same task. The button here should be easiest under two options. And you can see if I select the move tool now, we have our marching arms indicating a selection. But I've actually copied this one 2 times. So let me delete one layer, we don't need it. We are on our copy layer and now we can, for example, go to color and use hue and saturation and adjust the hue. There are only bluish tones in it. This is a tool, so this hue and saturation menu that I went over in detail in my Gimp beginner course. If you're interested, check that out. It's just to show you that our selection is impacted and everything else isn't, so especially the area below. And you can see how we could make this a little bit darker. One problem is select none. You can see it's not perfect on the edges. We can now try to use a feather. So press Ctrl Z. We've got our marching ants back. I go to select feather. And if we now reapply our color adjustment, we can create a smoother transition, but it's not perfect with the outline as I didn't go over it in detail. But you get the idea, and this is a good result for a 2-minute work. And if you don't zoom in that far, you don't even notice that something was adjusted if you didn't know. And important is that the color below, where there wasn't a selection, this is kept, so there was no adjustment happening there. Watch it again. Without a selection, you can see everything is now recolored, even the parts below. So this is why we did that in this specific case. What I would like you to do is to pick yourself an image as well and try to do that. So select the flower. I'm going to link to the specific image if you want to use the same. And get yourself familiar with these 3 editing modes. So there's design, edit, also used with the shortkey control, and move. You can also press Alt for that. If you can't find these 2 options, yet again, go to Windows, Dockable Dialogs, and there are the 2 options. When you have the paths tool active, you should see them then. After you've made your selection, make sure to apply an effect to see its results. In my case, I've used undercolors, the hue and saturation adjustment. For the next 2 features that I'm going to show you, we need another path. And by the way, I'm going to link to the specific images that I'm using. If I haven't that mentioned already, you'll find this image, for example, and all the others in the description below, so that you can use the same. Yet again, we'll use the path tool, design mode, and we'll go roughly over the edges. Don't worry too much about details in this case, because for our effects, it doesn't have to be a perfect selection. So we'll just go over this once, and we don't even care about curves or anything. We've arrived at the start. Switch to edit mode. You You can hold Control for that or do it manually under the Tools options. This should be what you see. Now you've got a couple of options. You can, for example, stroke the path directly. Same can be found under Edit, Stroke Path. Let us do that before I show you the second option. Here we want to use stroke line, solid color, and this uses the foreground color. In our case, black. Now it's white, black again. Let me make that red so we can see properly. Width is 10 pixels and I open line styles. And here I can use a dash preset. For example, dots or dashes. Many can be found here. Let me use dashes and I confirm. And now if I deselect the path tool, you can see we have this dashed outline. And you can also understand now why it's not that important to be perfect here in your selection. Let me show you how you can undo that properly. We need our undo history. If you can't find that, go to Windows, Document Dialogs, and there it is. So here under Connect Strokes, we have connected our path, but we can't see it anymore. It's still there, trust me. And we can see when we go to Paths. So this is the Paths menu and not the Layers menu anymore. And here we can make it visible and now we see it. If you can't find that menu, once again, Windows, Document Dialogs, and here, up here, you can find the paths. It should pop up. Make it visible and then there is your path again. And we could stroke it once more. But in our case, I'll show the second option. We'll simply go to select and now use from path. And this is going to turn this path into a selection. I can make the path invisible again and we have our marching ants. I'll switch back to the layers menu. And now if I want to stroke this, it's the same process. We just need a different menu because this is not a path anymore. It's a selection. Therefore we can't stroke a path. Instead we need to stroke a selection. But to do that, we'll first go to grow, under select, and now we grow it, let's say by 50 pixels. That's very huge, but you can see the effect now. It makes your entire selection grow proportionally. So this entire shape that's inside of the selection, you could say it gets scaled up. But let me go a little bit smaller. So press Ctrl Z and I make this only 20 in growth. That's better. We go to edit and now, as I've said, not stroke path. We need stroke selection. It looks the same. Has the same menu, it's just a different name. Keep that in mind. It's something to understand. If you work with the path, you need the path options, and when you work with the selection, it's the select options. But the menu looks exactly the same. Let me give that a white color in this case. So make white the foreground color, and let me use dots. I confirm via stroke. Shift Ctrl A to deselect, and now we have this dotted outline. It's a little bit outside of our path because of the growth, and this is how you can do that. Let us go back to this position. So before we grew it, and we can also shrink it. This is just the opposite direction. If we shrink that by, let's try 10, you can see it gets sucked in a little bit. But let me make that a bit more extreme. I tried 25. And again, I want to give that a stroke, so we need edit, stroke selection. I'll make it red again, line style, I pick. Let me use dashes again, I confirm. Now it's not an outline, it's more an overline or whatever you want to call this, an inline. But I think it's clear what shrink and grow does when it comes to selections. For you to practice, what I want you to do is to create your outline. So use the path tool like I did. Make sure to close this path and then use select from path to get your marching ants. We've done that already, so I'm not going to go over this once more. You can also right click, select from path if you want to do that, but it can also be found here under select from path. Once that is done, grow it by 25 pixels. I want you to give it a bluish turquoise color. Something like this. And then go to Edit and Stroke Selection. Pick Stroke Line, Solid Color. Make it 15 pixels for line width. Open the line style and use normal dots. Confirm via stroke. Then Shift Ctrl A to deselect, and this is the first that I want you to recreate. I also want you to create a shrink, but be careful. If you try to copy this now and apply it, it won't work because of the history. Whenever you use the undo history to get back your selection, you will also erase the growth. I don't want to do that here. So instead, I'll show you a second option to find or to, let's say, resurrect your selection. And it's under the paths menu that I've already shown you. Make it visible, and then you can simply go to select from path. And you've got your marching ants back, and we still have our grow example up here. Let me rename that. And I want to make the second one a shrink. Second one is active. I go to select and shrink it by, let's say, 15. Give it more like a pinkish color. Then we'll go to Edit, Stroke Selection, and this time use the same values, so solid color, stroke line 15 pixels for line width, but make this short dashes and confirm via stroke. Shift Ctrl A yet again, and this should be your end result. So you have a shrink and a grow. Try to recreate that. And once you've got that done, you're ready for the next chapter. Let me show you another selection tool. Let's just say we have something like this. Clean background. And we want to select the background. One way to do it would be to do it manually. You can try to use the rectangle tool or our paths tool. But it's a lot of work in many cases. So it's way easier to try to use the other tools. In this case, as we have a clear background, a very clean background, and it has a strong contrast with these pencils, we can try to use the Select by Color tool. You can find that here. Shift O is the short key, and if you can't find it, go to Tools, Selection Tools, and here for some reason they called it by Color Select tool, but it's the same. Color Select, Select by Color, whatever you want to call it. Shift O is the short key. Select it, and once you've got that, you'll find the two options. Here again, we have our 4 selection modes, and once more, Windows dockable dialogues, and the 2 options can be found here. Anti-aliasing, the feather option. Then there are 2 new ones that we haven't yet seen for select transparent areas. So if there's transparency on your layer, this can be selected too. In most cases, you want that, so check the box. And also sample merged for multiple layers. For the most part, you don't want that, so leave it unchecked. The threshold is the only way to adjust this tool, but you can also pick a different select by option here in the dropdown. So it picks a different, you could say, unit. In this case, might be a good word. For the most part, you want to have composite. Then you have the color channels, RGB, and the alpha channel. You can select by HSV, so hue saturation value, and by lightness, the chroma, and once again, LCH hue. For the most part, you want to have composite, so leave the defaults here and then focus on the threshold, which is much more interesting and also much more impactful. When you just left click on any area on your canvas, in this case our little photo here, it already starts selecting stuff. In this case, as we have a clean background, it has almost given us a perfect selection right away, but we can adjust that using the threshold. And this basically determines what is selected in relation to the spot that we are on. So you hover over a spot on your image and left click, and whatever color there is in this specific point, it will be selected. But for the most part, you don't have that specific color everywhere. So in this case, it's more like a yellowish gradient. So you don't want to have just one specific yellow color selected, but also colors that are neighbors of this color. So different shades, different tones of yellow. And this can be adjusted using the threshold. Threshold goes from 0 to 255, as there are 256 colors in this RGB mode, in this composite that's used. So when you increase the threshold, more and more colors are added to the selection. And you can see when we make that relatively big, we don't just have the yellow color, but also gray colors included. Therefore, our pencils are selected as well, and only the black parts in the shadows are left out. And when you go very, very low and you left click, it's going to pick only very specific yellowish color tones. And in this case, it takes a long time to select them. So depending on where you are, it's a lot of processing work for the tool for Gimp in the background. Be aware of that. But here we are now. In our case, we definitely want to go higher. Let me try like 40. Even higher than that. There you go, around 60. It catches all of the yellow tones, but leaves out the pencils and the shadows. And there's also a little bit of an orange shadow that's not covered. And now we've got our selection. I've got it copied. So if I adjust it now, let's say under colors, we will change the color of everything selected, which is everything but the pencils and the shadows. And you can see that here. Depending on the image that you've got, this is definitely a helpful tool that gets you quick results. Here in this case, the shadows would be a problem. So to make it look natural, we would have to work a little bit in detail on the shadows with different tools. But let me show you an example where it's very quickly understood how great for us this select by color tool can be. Here's a logo on a gradient background. Very high contrast between the logo and the background. So you select by color, left click. Threshold of around 50 is totally fine to select the entire background, and the logo is unaffected. And when I go higher and I click on the logo, I can easily select that, and I can add parts to the selection easily by using the second mode. Let's just say you select something like this. So we have the background, but there are also some fragments in the logo, especially here the trademark symbol. You can see that there are some marching ants. One way to solve that issue, we'll use the rectangle tool and then select the subtraction mode. And then just select this part that you want to exclude from the selection. Here are some fragments. Depending on the zoom level, you can see that. And this is how you can fix these smaller issues. Let me copy this. We've got the background selected, so everything but the logo, and I use colors. Again, use saturation. And if I adjust it, only the background is affected. So whenever you have a strong contrast between what you want to select and everything that you don't want to select, try to use the select by color tool. It gives you quick results. You only have to adjust the threshold a little bit and maybe clean up some fragments using other tools in the subtraction mode. Let me show an example where it wouldn't work at all. It's this parrot right here. You can see that a lot of green tones in it, not just the background, but the parrot itself. Also some vegetation below that's greenish. So if we use the select by color tool here and try to select the bird, there is no chance. We won't be able to do it. No matter what threshold we try, even selecting the background won't give us good results. There are just too many similarities between the background and the foreground. Forget about this tool when dealing with such images. As I've said, you need a strong contrast, and then this is your tool of choice. For you to practice, I've linked to these specific images, but you can, as always, pick your own. Definitely try it for this IKEA logo image, because here it works quite well, so that you understand that this is a matter of seconds, and then you're ready for the next chapter. Let us use another selection tool, and this time we'll check the fuzzy select. But first, let us go back to select by color. I use a threshold of 32, and I try to select the background so that we can cut out the earth here. I have to go a little bit higher, but if I go too high, you can see parts of the earth are being selected too. But I still don't have the background fully, and for such tasks, the fuzzy select is the better tool. It looks and almost works exactly like select by color. If you can't find it, tools, selection, tools, fuzzy select, short key would be U. It has the same options, the same 4 selection modes. Here's only one new feature, which is diagonal neighbors. And just to explain the difference between the fuzzy select and the select by color, it's going to explain to you what diagonal neighbors are, because the fuzzy select also uses the color to make selections, so we can go on a threshold from 0 to 255, but it also puts into consideration if these colored pixels that are being selected are neighbors, or in this case diagonal neighbors. So you can see the fuzzy select as a select by color, but it also checks for certain areas in your photos, in your images. So in this case, it kind of knows that there is a background and there is an earth in the middle, and it can distinguish between these two elements in your image and doesn't just take the colors into consideration. And therefore this is a great tool to cut stuff out from the background, especially when you have a background that has almost the same color or a similar color to the foreground. In this case, threshold of 41.5 is totally enough to select the background. Let me use the same value for both tools. So I had 49, I used that for the fuzzy select as well. Left click on the background and we have no selection whatsoever on the earth. For the select by color we have. So there are some colors similar in the foreground on the earth, but the fuzzy select understands that this is a different element in your photo. Therefore it doesn't select it and we have a clean background when we use this tool. Dropdown is the same here as for select by color. And just to show you how we could cut this now out, all we have to do is to use add alpha channel. So right click on the layer, add alpha channel, and I like to work on copy. So I copy this, make the origin invisible, and then I press the delete key. And here we have the checkerboard design pattern indicating that we have a transparent background. So this would be one method to cut objects, cut foregrounds out of images. Here's an example where you can clearly see the benefits of the fuzzy select tool compared to the select by color. I copy this, right click, add alpha channel, and I make the original invisible. I'm on the copy. I use select by color. 49 selects too much of the logo. I go down, left click again. We have still too much. I go down. And now we lose a little bit of the background. And we still have too much of the logo. We go to 35 and we're close, but I would have to go a little bit further down. 30. Now the logo isn't selected anymore, but we've lost a little bit of the background. And this is the issue with this tool, especially when you work on gradients. So the background has a grayish gradient, and some of the parts, they are close to what we have in the logo. So if I delete this now, we have smaller fragments. At this zoom level you don't see them that much, but now imagine this to be a billboard, imagine this to have a very high zoom level on a screen. You could see these fragments. Now we use the fuzzy select, threshold was 30, we use the same value here. I left click on the background and now I can go up. Let me try, oh I detached this now, but you can see it, I try 40, left click, and we're almost there, just a little bit higher, but it doesn't select anything from the logo. Let me even go to 54, we have a perfect selection, and it knows that it should leave the logo alone. Once again, selection tool, I try 50, left click, and we have parts of the logo. So stick to the fuzzy select when you want to select backgrounds, foregrounds. I can delete this now, we don't have any fragments at all. Let us go to a much more complex example. We've got our parrot again. I've already shown you that using the select by color wouldn't work. But we could work with the fuzzy select step by step. What you can do here is, let me try a lower threshold because we have parts of the parrot. At 50 we are already close. Let me try. And this looks good. For this specific section we are almost there. Let's just say I wanted to use the fuzzy select to cut out this parrot and get rid of the background. Let us go over this step by step. I right click on this layer, add alpha channel to have transparency, and then I simply press the delete key. I'll now go to the next section and try to find a good spot where the parrot isn't selected. Can't find it at 45, so I have to go lower. Let me try 30, and here we have the next part that we can select, and I just press the delete key over and over and select new parts. I may have to go even lower than this. Let's try 25, and you can see bit by bit, step by step, we'll get rid of the background, and that's not a bad result. Keep in mind, here for example you can see it, a little bit of the parrot was selected, so you have to be very careful with your threshold. But this would be way easier than using for example the paths tool and going over the outline step by step. And you can always press Ctrl Z if one selection went too far. But this is the process that you could use to even tackle these more complex examples with the fuzzy select tool. What I want you to do is find yourself some images, or just use mine. I've linked to them. You find that yet again in the video description, and then cut out a logo. Just like I did here. Just as a reminder, I had to edit an alpha channel before I was able to cut it out using the delete key. So don't forget adding that via right click on the layer and then play around with the threshold. In this case, it was pretty easy. And if you're still with me and interested, use a more complex example like this one with the parrot. Go over this step by step using a low threshold and see how far you can take this. Make sure to practice and then come back for the next chapter. You've seen a couple of limitations when it comes to using tools like the fuzzy select or select by color. And here it becomes abundantly clear when we use something where the contrast between foreground and background is not that extreme. So we need other techniques, other methods to work our way through this. Let me copy that and I add an alpha channel. So right click, add alpha channel. This gives me transparency. So if I, for example, cut this part out using the select tool and then press the delete key, you can see the checkerboard. So this is where we need the alpha channel. I use the fuzzy select and find a good threshold here. First step is to go over this roughly, but you can see here we run into problems. Number one is it's going to select a little bit of the bird that we want to keep, and it's not really covering all of the stuff that we want to get rid of in the background. Even if I try a very low threshold for the select by color, it doesn't give us what we need. You can supplement this method by using masking techniques. And the first step that I like to use is to right click on this specific copy layer and then add a layer mask and make it white. So full opacity, just confirm via add. And now you have the layer mask and the layer in your layers menu. You can select them with the left click. Just make sure to be on the layer mask, the white thing. And if you now paint over it with the brush tool in black, make sure that the opacity is 100%. You can adjust the size here in the two options. If I paint over this, you can see I can subtract stuff from this layer and make this transparent. But if you paint on the layer itself and not the layer mask, you're going to paint over it with the black color. So this is not what you want. Let me press Ctrl Z. I'll go back to the layer mask, left click drag, and this transparency. So make sure that you have that set up. And if I make this white as a foreground color, I can bring back parts of this layer. So white reveals, black conceals. This is the usual saying when it comes to using layer masks. Let me add a background to have more contrast. I'll make this fully black. And now we can see a couple of parts that we don't need. So I'll go back to the layer mask, use the brush tool. Black is my foreground color. And I paint over this. And this helps me to clean up the backgrounds and get rid of it. In these smaller areas down here, I need to resize my brush. So here's the two options and go over this a little bit in detail. Once again, it's always a black color that conceals any opacities 100% to get rid of it all. It also makes sense to go over the outlines because usually you're going to have a little bit of a halo effect when you select objects. So a little bit of the background is still visible and you can clean that up with a mask. In this case, it may make sense to use a fully red background and check. Background looks fine, but you can now see the gaps that we have in the bird. So there are a lot of parts that we deleted even though we needed them, and the feathers. And this is where we are going to use another mask. To do that, we'll copy the original and put it on top. I'll make it visible again, and then right click add layer mask, and this time make it fully black for full transparency. Again, we'll paint on the mask, not the layer. Use the brush tool, and we want to paint over it in white, as this brings back parts. You can see that right here. And now all that we have to do is to paint over the bird wherever we see this reddish color. And this is going to fix the issues here. Don't worry too much if you paint over the edges too far. You have your mask to clean that up. But be careful not to go on the mask below. You need to be on this mask that is fully black, or that was fully black. Switch the colors to black. You can also press X for that, which is the short key, and then go over these areas that you don't need. Let me check. Oh, we've got a good selection here. So this is the method that you can use to improve your selections. Once you're happy, just make this invisible, and I delete it. I go to the top layer, and now I use the merge function down here. And this is going to merge the layers with the layer masks, and at the same time merge these two layers that we've created for our masking method. So once you've covered the basics of using the selection tools, this would be the next step. Learn to use masking and combine these two methods to get better results. As stated in the last chapter, the previous tools were the main tools, or the main selection tools that I use. There are some more. I would just call them side tools, or tools I don't really use, but they are available in Gimp. For example, the free select. I rarely use this. It has the same modes, anti-aliasing and feather edges, and it's fairly simple to understand. It's just left clicking and freely dragging, and if you close the shape, you've got your selection. Let me add that on a new layer. Shift Ctrl A. You can also left click, drag and hold, and this gives you the scribble line. So when you work, for example, with one of these graphic pens, this might be something that you would rather use than a path tool. But I don't usually work with a pen, and I think that the path tool is the better option when you work with a mouse. The only reason for me to use it would be when I don't need a perfect selection. I just want to roughly cover a certain area that's not a rectangle or an ellipse. Let us, for example, create a rectangle here, a bluish one. Shift-Control-A, and now assume we want to see that fully. So we could, for example, use a layer mask on this white element. So on the layer where the white element is, the shapes layer, I could just create a rough shape like this, and then use selection for the layer mask, and you've cut that out. So if you have a rough shape, you just want to quickly drag over this. The free select might be the tool of choice. But as I've said, I rarely use it, if I use it at all. The paths tool is the better choice. But one thing that it does that is kind of cool, it gives you negative shapes. So if I create these overlaps like this, and now I use maybe a greenish color bucket fill tool and I left click on it, I need to be on the layer obviously. I left click, you can see you get these shapes with negative shapes inbuilt. So that's an interesting feature for certain effects. Or when it comes to repositioning the nodes, you can do that, you know it, in the path tool. You can hover over the lines and give them curves. You can't really do that with the free select tool. You can adjust the positions of these nodes by left clicking and dragging. But to my knowledge, you can't just turn this into a curve and give it an angle. And this is why I prefer using the paths tool instead of the free select for most tasks. But I wanted to cover this so that you have at least seen this tool. Next tool on our list is the Scissor select tool. Let me copy the layer. I like to work on copies, as I've mentioned a couple of times. We are on the copy and here it can be found. Scissor select tool. Some people I've heard call this an inbuilt AI tool in Gimp. I think that's taking it a little bit too far. It's not AI, but nowadays so many programs are called AI, so why not call it this here as well? What makes this somewhat AI is that it can detect contrast. So here in this case we have a white background and then the camera, which is black or has darker shades. And if we left click with the scissor select, you can see that this line jumps very, very close to the camera. So it kind of understands where the white pixels end and where the dark ones start. And this is how you can use this tool. It once again has the same 4 modes: anti-aliasing, feather edges, and then this last option here for interactive boundary. If you're a beginner, don't bother using this. Not that important. It's just a different display feature. Functionality is more interesting. Let us just go over this camera in full. All I do is left click and go over the outline. So there is no curves like with paths tool. And here, for example, we have a couple of edges, a couple of teeth, you could say, for this little wheel. And even here, it tries to find a good outline and it kind of detects where this contrast starts between the light, the bright colors, and the darker colors. Here we have a little bit of a problem because the shadow is very dark and it comes close to the color of the camera. When you've arrived at the end, just click on the first node that you've created right here. And now, this is the important step. It looks kind of like a path. So your first instinct would be to right click and then select from path. But select from path is grayed out, so you can't use that as this is not really a path. So even though it looks like you've created one with the paths tool, it's not a path. If you actually turn this into a selection, let me left click somewhere here so that the box is gone. And now you have to press enter. And this is all that it takes. And you can see it has even done a good job here with the shadow. So this auto detection inbuilt, it tries to find the edges, the outlines of the shape that you've drawn using the tool. But if I zoom in very far, you can see it's not perfect. So there's going to be some white spaces in it and it missed a couple of black spots. Not a bad tool, but not a great tool either. If you want to have perfect selections, you can't get around the paths tool in such cases, as the scissor select isn't that precise. But here, let us continue with this selection. We'll right click, add layer mask and use selection, confirm. And now you can see we've created a cutout. Let me press Shift Ctrl A and I create a new layer. And I put this in between the original that still has the background and our cutout. I make it transparent and then we call that rectangle layer. So we create a rectangle first. I use the rectangle select. Just to give you a quick example, I'll make it red. Bucket fill tool, left click on it, Shift Ctrl A. Not a bad results, but only when it comes to the first look. And here zoomed in, you can see these white spots. This is where the selection wasn't perfect. So we would have to work on this manually a little bit more in detail using, for example, masking and the brush. And this is why I don't really use this tool that much. You have to put in some extra work afterwards anyway, so why not use the paths tool directly? But here in this case, we could, for example, add a text behind object effect. Let me just do something quickly here. It's a Canon EOS. So we'll place it like this, maybe. And if you want to recreate that, in the end, just select the top layer of your text, in my case the EOS, and then use the merge function down here to merge it with the text, the other one, and merge it again with the rectangle layer. And now this is all in one layer, and you can reposition that behind your camera and in front of the background. So this is what a typical text behind object effect would look like. Try to create something like this yourself. I'll leave it up to you if you want to use the scissors tool. You've seen how it works, and you've also seen that it's not going to give you perfect results. So you might want to check out the paths tool as well. As I said, it's up to you, but just make sure to practice something. And once you're done, come back for the next chapter. I've decided to collect a couple of features in this chapter because this is stuff that I usually don't use, and the use cases are rather small. But I wanted to cover them because this is I hope, comprehensive course on making selections. At first we'll create a selection. Let me use the free select tool. We've got our marching ants. And you can now go to select and there are options to sharpen this. And even to make them more scribbly, more random. And there's the Distort function right here. A couple of adjustments can be made. In simple terms, the higher you go, the more random it's going to be. at least for the first 3 values, and then you can smoothen it out a little bit with the 4th value. If you want to have random results, you're basically fine with the default values in most cases anyway. So I would advise you to just keep that. If you think that's too random, then try to go a little bit lower with the first 3 values. And this even works on a very strict selection, like using the rectangle select 2 for 1. I add this distort once more. Let me make that maybe red. Shift-Ctrl-A to deselect. So there are some use cases for this distort function, which is why we'll go over a specific project for it. And for that we'll go back to our parrot. We want to create a paper torn, a ripped paper effect. First thing that we need to do is to right click on the original and add alpha. So we have an alpha channel that gives us transparency. I'll copy the original, make it invisible, and on the copy I'll use the free select just to show you that this is not a bad tool and it can be used for quick selections where you don't have to be perfect. Once it's closed, I'll go to Distort, under Select. Let me go a little bit down with the first 3 values and up with Smooth. Next up, we want to cut it out and paste it. We can do that under Edit or just use the short keys Ctrl X and Ctrl V. This is going to give us a so-called floating object. You can use floating objects and put them on new layers or connect them to existing layers. We just want to have a new layer, so I click on New Layer right here, and our floating object is now on the second layer. And you can see the edges are fairly random, which would happen if we would tear up a photo. Now let me rotate this a little bit. Afterwards I want to add a drop shadow. To see that, it's a good idea to add a background first. Let me make that red. Paint bucket tool, left click on it. And now I position this below the other 2 layers that we've got. So our 2 parts of the photo. I'm on the top one. Filters, light and shadow, drop shadow. Adjust it a little bit. I'm fine with this. Now next up, we'll add some white areas. For that we'll need another layer. Let me call it white parts. It's transparent yet again. I confirm. I want to put that below my 2 photos. So on top of the red background is now this empty layer, which is for the white parts. I flip to white as a foreground color, use the paintbrush. Increase the size, and we actually don't want to have this blur effect, so I have to increase the hardness. And if there was too much, just press Ctrl Z and go over it again. You want to make this yet again random and don't paint over every area. Something like this should be fine. I only want to add that to one side. That's usually the case when you have a ripped photo. Once that is done, we can simply copy this layer. So our white parts, and I rename that because I want this to be gray. Right click on it, alpha to selection, which is going to select these white areas. I pick a grayish color, use the paint bucket tool, and left click on these areas. Shift Ctrl A, And now I go for this gray layer to the blending mode and I pick dissolve. This should be the second option after normal. And then you go down, and if I zoom in, you can see the lower you go, the less you have of these grayish pixels, these fragments. We want to have something like that. So this would be a quick torn paper effect, and using this distort function for select has helped us to making that more realistic. If you're interested, not a bad idea to practice, so try to recreate this effect. Well, we've got some more options here under select that I want to talk about. As I've said, I rarely use them. In fact, I can't remember ever using the remove holds function, but border and remove holds exist, and let me show you how they work. So we use select by color for this black element, left click on it, and then we go to select and use border. You can adjust the pixels here. I'll just confirm for 20 pixels, and this gives us the outline of this element. So this can detect and then grow a little bit the borders, the outline of your selection. In some cases, that's not a bad thing to have. It makes some things easier. Let me, for example, add a bluish color, and you can see we've added now a blue stroke, basically a blue outline to our tool. Let me make these parts invisible and we'll go back to our original parrot. Now I use select by color, left click on it. You can see it selected a lot, but there are holes in it. You could call them that. So there are simple spacings between these selections, and you can try to use select and then remove holes. In the background, it actually did a good job, but it's not a perfect tool. So if we, for example, press Shift Ctrl A and I try to select the parrot at once, so left click on it, and now I try to use remove holds, it's not like it would detect the entire parrot and give you a great selection. So use cases for this tool, for this function, is very rare. As I've said, I can't remember ever using that, but I wanted to cover this so that we have at least talked a little bit about it. Once more, if you need practice, try to recreate this torn paper effect for a photo. And once you've got that done, we'll dive into a next topic in the next chapter. Let me show you the final of the big tools. It's the foreground select. To use it, we'll copy this one and we'll work on a copy. It can be found right here. If you can't see it, go to Tools, Selection Tools, and there you should definitely find it. Again, we have our 4 modes, feather edges, and then there are 3 drawing modes. So you can also select backgrounds with it, even though it's called foreground select. I would advise you to just keep the first mode, stroke width. I'm going to explain that later. Preview mode. Let me just change the color to red. It's kind of like the typical color for these masks, so we'll keep it red. Forget about the rest for now. We'll just use this. The first step when you use it is to left click, drag and create an outline. Just make it rough and make sure that you don't cut into your subject, in this case the dog, which is in the foreground. When you close this, you're going to see this circle. Just make sure you are on it and then release the left mouse. So this is your first step. Second is to use the stroke width, but you can't just use it right away. First you have to press enter. And to make that successfully work, you have to activate this. So if you've closed this shape by clicking on the small circle that we've seen, and then you've clicked anywhere like I did, I just clicked on the stroke width size, pressing enter won't work anymore. You have to go back first to this line, find the circle, left click on it and then press enter. And then you can see whatever color you've picked, in my case red. And this is the starting point. And now we can also see this big circle, which is resized by the stroke width. And if we left click drag, you can see we basically bring parts to our selection now. Be careful when you draw over the edges, just press Ctrl Z to go back one step. Again, you don't have to be perfect here with the edges, just make sure to cover the big parts. And you may want to size the circle down a little bit and go over these edges just slightly. When you think that you've covered enough, you can check the box up here under Preview Mask. And then you can see what's being added by this automated system to the selection, or what is going to be added to the selection later on. And that's not a bad selection, to be honest. When you think it is, you can uncheck this box and then add more parts. Huge problem is always hair and fur. You can see here on the edges, it's going to blend a little bit with the background, therefore we're not going to have a perfect selection. But let us just assume that you're happy with this. Preview the mask and then confirm via select right here. This may take some time depending on the image size, your CPU power. But once it's done, you should see your selection. And as I've said, it's not bad. It has missed a couple of pixels right here on the ear and on the fur below, but still not bad for such a quick work. In our case, we'll just use it on a layer mask, so right click on the copy, add layer mask, pick selection, confirm via add, Shift-Ctrl-A to deselect. And depending on the color that you now use for the background, let us create an empty layer, make it transparent, and I put it below this selected copy layer. For example, use white, we can easily get away with it. If we use black, the contrast is too high and now we can see that the selection on the edges wasn't perfect, especially here. But by using white, we can easily get away with it. In general, I think it's not a bad tool, especially when you don't have that much contrast between the background and the foreground. In this case, both elements had a lighter color, therefore the fur was selected a little bit and a little bit is missing. So using the fuzzy select wouldn't give us that much better results. Therefore, trying the foreground selector is not a bad idea. Let me go over this quickly by using the fuzzy select. I copy this layer again. I'll select the fuzzy select tool. Let me go down with the thresholds. And I simply add an alpha channel so that we have transparency. And then I press delete. Let us have a look at the fur. So we've missed a couple of elements here as well, and we would have to bring some back using a layer mask. But you could see it's comparable to what we had with the foreground select, and I think that this is much quicker. Therefore, I like to use the fuzzy select tool and then try to get around these little issues using the layer mask method that I've shown you earlier. But again, the foreground select is not a bad tool. Just try it out, pick the same image, I've linked to it, or pick your own, and then just decide for yourself if you want to work with that instead of the fuzzy select. It's just my personal preference to rather use the fuzzy select, as it's a little bit quicker, I think. A little bit of a side note is the selection editor. It's not really a tool, but it's, let's call it a helper, a simple guide. Because sometimes you select something and because of the low contrast you can't really see it anymore, especially when you invert the selection. You don't know, did you now select this box or everything except this box? We can press Shift-Ctrl-A first and deselect it. We can go to Windows, Dockable Dialogs right here, and then you should find the menu called Selection Editor. This can't be found under Tools and Selection Tools, so it's more, as I've said, a helper, a menu. Let's open it, and here on the right we should see by default. I'll select something and now you can see this white box. And this indicates our selection. Everything that's black is not selected and the white parts are. Let me switch the mode to replace. You can see how the white areas change, and even if I add stuff. There are a couple of simple options below. Select everything, delete selection, and inversion. So this is the fun part, I think, where this menu, the selection editor, is really helpful, because if I click on it, we can invert the selection and the white areas are now outside of this shape. So you can flip this easily. You can dismiss the selection, select all, as I've said. There's also an option to put it on a different channel. We can turn it into a path. And here is now our selection turned into a path. And finally, we can stroke it here directly. So yet another option to add a stroke to selection. Just left click and you get your stroke selection menu. We make it a line. Foreground color is black. Shift Ctrl A, and you can see that this is another way to create such frames. It's nice to have, nothing special. I think the only real use case is this inversion, so that you don't get lost with what's selected and what isn't. Once again, you find it under Windows, Dockable Dialogs. Try it out yourself, and then come back for the next chapter where we will actually work on a couple of projects. Let me show you a handful of projects where we actually use selections. It's just the beginning, obviously, but when you use all of these tools on a specific topic, you can see that sometimes some of these tools are better than others, and sometimes you even want to get a quick job done and you don't worry too much about the details. So this first project is about using an outline to getting around more complex selections, and I'm pretty sure you've seen that in YouTube thumbnails. It's an often used effect, and I believe for a very good reason, because it lets you get away with not having perfect selections. And once again, if you want to work on the same photo, I've linked to it in the video description below. I'll copy this one as I like to work on copies, and then I use the fuzzy select and I check the threshold, try to find a good spot. And this is not bad, 37.5. Here we lose a little bit, but we could get a good selection. Let me right click, add alpha channel. And now use the delete key, and I get over this. At some point I have to fix the threshold and try again. But you can see at this point it's very tough, as there are so many similar tones in the backgrounds and on the model. So in this specific case, I would actually rather use the Paths tool to make my selection. To do that, we'll copy the original yet again. In the first step, I just go over the outlines roughly. I hold Control when I close the path. Second step is to adjust the curves. So left click drag when I hover over these lines and adjust the angle a little bit. Once that is done, let me add an alpha channel. And then I click on selection from path. I have to invert it under select and then I press the delete key. Selection is still active, as you can see. And when we zoom in, we can see these little details that aren't perfect. And one way to deal with it is to just give it an outline. So we use stroke selection under edit. We make that 20 white and I use line. I confirm. Shift Ctrl A to deselect. And there you go. All of these little details that weren't perfect, they don't play a role anymore. So if you use this effect, even the hands here, nobody's really questioning if that was a good selection or not. And this is one of the reasons why this is used so much on YouTube. Even if I give this now a high contrast background, let me make that black. You can see we could get easily away with it in a YouTube thumbnail. So if you don't want to invest that much time, you just want to have a quick result, just try to use outlines and you can get easily around having to fix all of these little details in your selections. As I've said, the same image can be found in the video description. Try to work on that yourself and then come back for the next project. We're going to select the same model now, but instead of getting around issues here and there using an outline, we're going to use layer masks. So it's the same method that I've already introduced in chapter 8, but we're going to go over this in detail, so it's going to be a little bit longer. It's just to show that everything works, even with a little bit more complex selections. So first step, we'll copy it, add an alpha channel, and then I go over this using the fuzzy select. You know all of that already. Then I create a background, so I'll make it black to check what we've missed here, and it's quite a lot. I'll delete the rest. And once we've done that, it's time to use the layer mask. So right click on this layer, add layer mask, make it fully white. We're going to paint on it using the brush tool. Black foreground color, make sure opacity is 100% and adjust the size right here. Just for explanation, all of the shortkeys that I'm using, I use the spacebar to move around an image. I use X to flip quickly between foreground and background color, in my case black and white. And from time to time I have to resize this brush. Once you are in this resize field, this input field, you can use the arrow keys up and down and see the size of your brush directly in the window. So we're done removing these excess parts, but we have sadly deleted a couple of elements from the original that we need. And we can make that clearly visible by using a reddish background. I need to copy the original, put it on top, add a layer mask, this time fully black. And now I paint over this using a white foreground color. And it's the same game. Alright, But that should be it. As I've said, it was a little bit longer, but I wanted to give you a very detailed example. I'm happy with this one, so I delete the red background layer. Then I go to the top layer and I use the merge function down here. And this merges all of these layer masks and the two layers so that we have now our cutout. If you want to work on the same, it's a good idea to work on something similar at least. But if you work exactly on the same, the link to the image is in the description below. And here we have a very complex example. Hair is always a little bit of a problem. And when you have not that much contrast compared to the background, you're going to run into problems quickly. So even with all of the methods combined that I've shown you, we will not be able to get a perfect selection here. Let us try it anyway. We copy it, add alpha channel, then use the fuzzy select, try to find a good threshold. Once that is done, we still have some stuff to clean up. Let me use the free select and shift Ctrl A in between. Once that is done, we can try to use a layer mask and clean up the edges and some of the areas, but you can quickly see when it comes to the hair, we will not be able to do that perfectly, or it's going to be an hour-long job, maybe even more. So when you encounter something like this, I would actually advise you to check out these AI tools, these AI apps that are coming out now. There are lots that claim to be AI and aren't AI, but they are labeled like that, so I'm going to use this term. Whatever these tools are, they do it automatically for you, and there are background removers that can do that. Something that does that completely for free, at least as I'm making this video, is Remove BG. You'll find a link to it in the video description. We will use the same image here, just drag and drop it. It starts process right away, and within a couple of seconds we'll have our result. If you want to have the HD version, you have to sign in. But if you don't even want to do that, you can get the lower resolution option right here without even signing in. Everything's free, as I've said. Just drag and drop it into Gimp. I need to scale this up now as it's smaller. And if we compare this to the original, you can see it has done quite a good job. Still not perfect, but the edges look fine. And these nasty areas right here in the hair, they were cleaned up somewhat successfully. After you've done that, it's still a good idea to use a mask and then go over smaller spots using the brush tool, for example here. So you will not get perfect results even with these AI tools, with these automatic tools. But if you use everything that I've shown you up to this point in combination, you're going to get very good results. And you're going to be set for like 99% of the cases that you encounter, especially when you're quote unquote just working on social media designs. You're totally fine with these results. And if you've worked through this course up until now, you're good to go. I'm still going to add a couple of chapters now for advanced selection tricks where you can get even these smaller details done. So if you're still interested, just check it out. For everyone else, thanks for watching, and I hope that this course was helpful. As promised, we'll continue with a couple of more advanced techniques that you can use. Let me rename this. This is our original. We'll copy it as always to work on the copy. And now we can use something that is basically the fuzzy select, the select by color tool, and the add alpha channel in combination. And you can find that under layer transparency. It's called color to alpha. And this tool is quite good when you have a background that has a totally different color than the hair. So in our case, black hair, somewhat white, bluish background. You can set the color here via the swatch or use a color picker. And then you use these two sliders and you can see the effect in real time as long as the preview is checked in this menu. And it's very intuitive. So sample color, if I, for example, sample this one, you can see the background comes back. When I sample the background, we have it set to 0 for now, so nothing changes, but I select the background and now I use the sliders, and bit by bit it vanishes. If you go too far, you can also see that the face, the skin color is now vanishing. Best way to understand these two sliders is to just use them. So you can see these real-time effects are visible directly, and this is what makes this tool very helpful. But before we celebrate, this looks like a good selection, but still we've missed a couple of spots and there's also a little bit missing from the skin. So even that isn't perfect. And you can see that very clearly if I give it a background with a high contrast, I make that red, for example. And you can see in the hair we have all of these grayish tones. So still not a perfect solution, but if you use it in combination with a couple of other tools and methods, we can go further and further towards a perfect selection. Let me copy the original again and I rename this. So the first one was without, and now I use a pre-selection, for example, with the pre-select tool here. I go over the parts that I want to keep, but make sure that you don't cover any of these negative shapes, these background parts that shine through the hair. We'll close our shape, and now we'll have to invert this as the model is selected. Let me show you this in the selection editor. So we want the other parts to be selected. So select invert. And now again, we'll go to layer, transparency, color to alpha. And now we are sure that we don't mess up anything inside of the model, except for the edges. And now we can crank these sliders up a little bit more. Afterwards, copy the original, give it a layer mask, and use our usual method to bring back parts, especially here on the edges. And there you go. We still have these problems here with these grayish parts, as this was a very complex hair selection. But this is yet another tool that makes your life a little bit easier. And if you use in combination the methods that I've shown you, so for example this masking effect, you can go further and further towards a perfect selection. And then it's all about how much time do you invest into cleaning up these very small areas. As always, you will find this image in the description below so that you can check out the color to alpha tool yourself using the same image. If you're still with me, this is going to get a little bit more complex than what we did before. So pause the video at every step and do it directly one step at a time. Let's just say we have something like this, and we'll try to select it properly using our fuzzy select or any of the other methods. See, we're going to lose these fine hairs at the top, so this is not a good way to do it. We'll have to do some pre-work. To do that, we'll copy the original, and now we'll desaturate this first. So we'll make sure that we only have black and white. It doesn't matter what mode you use here, I just use luminance, the default. Next up, we use the curves. And here we want to drag this bottom part down, and this makes the darker parts darker. And then we'll drag the upper part up, which makes the lighter parts lighter. So we get this extreme S-curve. Be a little bit careful with the background. You can see, depending on where you drag it, you make this darker, and we don't want that. We want the background as light as possible and the model and its hair as dark as possible. So there is no sweet spot here that applies to every image. You have to drag and then adjust it depending on the image that you use. This one should be fine. And afterwards we use the levels and can adjust it a little bit further. In essence, as I've said, you want to have everything that you want to keep, in this case the hair, as dark as possible and everything else as white as possible. What we now do is we'll invert it under colors, so that now everything that we want to keep is white and everything that we want to get rid of is black. Or at least in our case, grayish and darker. You can see we'll have to do a little bit of work afterwards. The chest and at the bottom part of the background, but this is, I would say, quite fine and we can work with that. Now we'll copy the original again, make it visible, and then I give it a layer mask. Just make this white for now. Then go to what we've created, so this inverted black and white, and press Ctrl C to copy it. Then you select the layer mask, so not the layer mask, and press Ctrl V to paste it. It should give you a floating object in Gimp by default, and now you only have to left click on this anchor icon and it will be your new layer mask now. So what we've taken is this inverted color layer, this desaturated and then dealt with layer, and we've made this the layer mask of the original. And if I make this invisible now, you can see this is not a bad result. Especially when I give it a background, I make it red so that we have high contrast. As I've said, we'll have to work a little bit here and there on the chest. And we'll do that with our usual methods. Here we can directly paint on the layer mask. In our case we need a white color. And we have to fix the edges a little bit with a black color, as this was grayish and not fully dark when we've used it as a layer mask. What you can also see is still not a perfect selection, but we were able to keep, I would say, 95%, maybe a little bit more of the hair. So this is not a bad technique. And you can apply that to any image, even colored ones. You know what, let us go over a second example right here. I open this in a new project. I copy this, then I desaturate the copy. Afterwards, I use the curves, create this extreme S shape. Play around with the levels. Almost want to have a silhouette of what we want to keep. Then we need the original again, add a layer mask, and we need to invert our edited layer. Now Ctrl C and Ctrl V to paste it as a layer mask. And you can see we need to fix it a little bit only using brushes. And if I give this a background, not a bad result. Try to understand this method yourself, do it a couple of times. And now it's a little bit more steps than we've used so far, but you can also see it gives you good results. We've gotten through all of these selection tools available in Gimp, or at least all of the tools and methods that I know. My advice to you would be to practice, and definitely keep an eye on these AI tools as they are getting better over time. Currently, I would suggest using Remove BG first, so this automatic background remover whenever you have a more complex selection to do, and then clean up the results using a Gimp with the methods that I've shown you, especially the ones that I've given you in the last chapters. If you think that something was missing or there are additional questions about using Gimp, let me know in the comments below, and I'll make dedicated videos if I know an answer. In general, I hope that this course was helpful to anyone who wants to know more about how to use Gimp and how to make proper selections.